Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Stephanie Reynolds Westby, and as was said, I'm currently with NOAA, formerly with lots of different bay-oriented organizations, but largely revolving around oysters in one form or another. And so the topic I was asked to come and speak about today is a little bit about oyster restoration generally, but particularly the science that's underpinning some of our plans and implementation of the restoration activities, and then kicking it over to Howard, who's going to cover the ecosystem services portion of it. And I wanted to spend, there we go, just a very brief minute on the background and the policy context of this whole thing, because I know that this group is quite savvy about that. So as far as oyster restoration goes, there's a bunch of plans kicking around out there on the Chesapeake watershed that all, fortunately, have a lot of overlap, and they all align the Chesapeake Bay Executive Order, the new Chesapeake, soon-to-be signed Chesapeake Bay Agreement, Army Corps of Engineers Oyster Master Plan, Department of Natural Resources has an oyster aquaculture development and oyster restoration plan. And NOAA, you may have heard, recently selected the Chop Tank area as a habitat focus area. So all of these plans together have an interest in basically doing large-scale oyster restoration focused in particular tributaries where we can take, in the past oyster restoration has been very spread out, a couple acres here, a couple acres there. This is a very targeted and science-based approach to try to get to large-scale oyster restoration on a few distinct tributaries throughout the Chesapeake Bay. So fortunately, those goals align. We've been working very closely with a lot of other organizations on this, which I'll get to in a minute. But if you are reading this goal, again, that's going to be in the soon-to-be signed Chesapeake Bay Agreement. The oyster goal is to restore oyster populations in 10 tributaries. And if you read that closely, you might say, well, first of all, what do we mean by restore? And second of all, what do we mean by tributaries, right? So in order to really understand that goal and be able to begin to meet it, we needed to figure out what we collectively meant by that. So we went through a process that we called the Chesapeake Bay Oyster Metrics. So it was, it's a little washed out on the screen. This organization's here, NOAA, Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Natural Resources, Virginia Marine Resources Commission, University of Maryland, Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, plus 17 consulting scientists. And we all got together and figured out, what do we mean by restore? So on a reef level, what does a truly restored and functioning oyster reef look like? And then how many of those restored oyster reefs do we need in one tributary before we can call that tributary restored? So this was a process of setting metrics, and we all agreed to these bay-wide definitions, and I'll get a little bit into some of them, but the point is we're all measuring with a common yardstick, which is really very helpful, because at this point, the next step, once we decided what our metrics were, was to begin to plan and actually build and monitor these restored oyster reefs against those previously established oyster metrics. So in order to do that, the Sustainable Fisheries Goal Implementation Team convened oyster restoration work groups in Maryland and Virginia, and actually in Virginia it's going to be a couple of different work groups based on which tributaries we're engaged in, but in Maryland it's a single work group to do just these things, to plan the oyster restoration, collectively build or at least coordinate the building of the oyster reefs and the planting of the oysters, and monitor against those success criteria. So that's just a little bit of the policy background. On to where the rubber meets the road, which is where we planning to do all this. These are the initial candidate tributaries in Maryland and Virginia that we selected. The work group selected them on a combination of factors. Some of them were biological, things like present-day water quality that would support oyster restoration, a critical mass of hard bottom in each of these tributaries. That's really important, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when you restore an oyster reef, you can't build it on that soft Chesapeake Bay squishy mud. It just sinks under its own weight. And as you all probably know, most of the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay is like that. So we were looking at tributaries where there was the thought there was a goodly amount of nice hard bottom in order to be able to work some large-scale restoration, good recruitment, at least by today's standards, which is nothing compared to 100 years ago. But, are there still oysters there today? Do they still get some natural recruitment? And another factor that weighed in was presence or absence of a commercial fishery. In Maryland, we have these large-scale sanctuaries to work in. In Virginia, it's a little bit different, so we're working with a little bit more of a patchwork there. But we wanted to pursue this at least initially in tributaries where there was some legal ability to protect our work from commercial harvest. From here on out in the presentation, now that I've given you a little bit of the background, I'm kind of doing a case study of Harris Creek because that's the first tributary we selected, and it's further along than the others, and it's proving to be a bit of a template for the others. So I'm really following the Harris Creek process, and of course that may be adapted, and it may look quite different in Virginia, but it gives you a good idea. So in Maryland, the Oyster Restoration Work Group is NOAA, Army Corps of Engineers, Baltimore District, Department of Natural Resources, and the Oyster Recovery Partnership. And we are basically working together to create these oyster restoration tributary plans. Right now we've got a tributary plan in Harris Creek and draft plans in the Tread Avon and Little Choptank rivers. And basically those plans lay out, okay, what areas in this tributary can we work in order to be able to meet the tributary level metrics, to have a restored oyster, to have a restored tributary, and on a reef level, where are those specific reefs going to go, and how are we going to see them in order to be able to get there. So it's what resources do we need, how much reef building substrate, how many acres should we target, how many oysters, what's it going to cost, and the work group coordinates the implementation and tracks progress on those. So to the point of really this presentation here, which is the science really underpinning all of this, really falls into two main categories, and one is we use a lot of science to inform the site selection. So once we selected Harris Creek as a tributary, figuring out where within that tributary is suitable for oyster restoration, and starting with that. So if you look at this map, basically anything that's just the background, the nautical chart here, was either too shallow or too deep to support oyster restoration by some judgment calls we made. And then of the colorful areas, the grayed out areas are soft mud, and anything that's in bright colors is basically area that's hard enough to support oyster restoration. So that was sort of our starting point. We also, in the same analysis, did a water quality analysis. The green dots are water quality monitoring stations, did some modeling and included, or some interpolation and included some of those results. Basically in Harris Creek, happily we didn't find any sort of red flags in terms of water quality. Even in the middle of the summer, it met our water quality standards that we put forward. So from there, so that was the first step, and this, by the way, all of this acoustic benthic habitat characterization is done through the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office through a habitat assessment team. It's a really valuable piece of work to begin this process of where might we look to do this large-scale oyster restoration. So what we did after that was we basically sent these colorful areas, these potentially good oyster bottom habitat areas, off to, we actually contracted out to Versar and had them do an oyster population survey on all of those hard areas. And the cool colors here, the blues, are areas with very few or no oysters on them, all the way up to the warmer colors, the deep, deep reds. And this deepest red of all, which only is in a couple of spots here, those are areas that actually meet the Oyster Metrics criteria of an already restored reef, which by the way is 50 oysters per square meter and 50 grams of dry weight. Probably doesn't mean a lot to folks here, but there is an actual number behind that. So that was great. Dark red, ain't broke, don't fix it. We'll just track it and see how it does over the next few years. The other areas, if there were no oysters on it and we weren't getting any shell signature on it from our benthic habitat surveys or from our sonar surveys, those are areas that we selected to actually reconstruct the reef. So large amounts of some kind of hard substrate. It could be oyster shell, it could be concrete, rubble, could be stone. Different materials are going in there to physically rebuild the reefs, and then they will get planted over with juvenile oysters produced at Horn Point's oyster hatchery. These other areas that had not 50 oysters per square meter, but had some oysters per square meter, we figure those areas are doing pretty well. They're probably viable for oysters. They probably just need more oysters. So we were able to just plant hatchery-produced spat on shell directly on there. So sort of two restoration treatment types that went into that. So it was an overlaying of all these characteristics to help us decide where we should work and which restoration treatment each one of them needed. Substrate, reef building followed by seed, or just oyster seed. I'm going to skip ahead one slide here. This for all that sonar work and all of the population surveys and all that, before we put any oysters in the water, thank you, we're still sending divers down at this point to actually physically run a matrix across the reef and touch it and make sure, or the potential reef area, to make sure that that is in fact hard. So it's another step that we're taking. So when we put those two maps together, right, where's the hard bottom and where are the oysters, we came up with a series of polygons, and those polygons are the blue outlines that you see here, and those represent 377 acres on Harris Creek. The red is the outline of the sanctuary, and so those are the areas that we wanted to target for restoration. From there, this is actually a slightly modified polygons because we took our initial set of polygons, had a public open house. We have a group of about 18 consulting scientists working on this project, academia and researchers mostly, to help us consult, to see if they had any input on those polygons or our approaches generally. We also had to go to the Coast Guard to get their approval. There were certain permit processes that had to be done. And what we ended up with is what you see here. So this is the Tributary Plan, is to try and restore all 377 acres. And the green, the polygons that are filled in green, are the about 188 acres that have had restoration treatment so far. There's actually another 23 that just went in the last month, so it's changing daily, and we've started planting oysters this month on some of those. So it is moving forward. We're about halfway there, which is exciting. So once we figure out where we want to plant the oysters, and we plant them there and build reefs if necessary, the next element in terms of science guiding oyster restoration is the monitoring and analysis component, right? And that basically falls into two categories. We talked about the Oyster Metrics success criteria, right? So how many oysters are there? Is there 50 per square meter, or is there something less? Presence of absence of multiple year classes, and then some structural characteristics about the reef itself. If you build a reef and you go, thank you, if you build a reef and you go back 2 years later and your reef footprint is shrinking or the whole thing's sinking into the mud, that's, antithetical to your success criteria. You want to have a reef that's persisting and hopefully growing. And the other sort of arm of that are diagnostic parameters. So these are basically things that would explain some of this, right? Water quality things, signs of poaching, signs of predation, and oyster disease. So that's pretty straightforward. To wrap up here, how are the oysters doing? We planted the Oyster Metrics and the Tributary Plan that we developed, called to check in 3 years post-restoration treatment. And again, it's 6 years post-restoration treatment, and that 6 years would be the judgment call. Does this meet the criteria for success, yes or no, 6 years later? So the first 97 acres that we planted are due for their 3-year check-in this fall, so we'll be doing that very soon. But in the meantime, we do monitoring on a subset of sites annually, and they're doing pretty well. There's really promising results. I know we're coming down tight here, so just, it's my last slide. The planted oysters from the hatchery are surviving about double our anticipated rate. We're attributing that largely to the more sophisticated site selection area. They survive a lot better if you put them somewhere besides the mud and where they have good water quality. Dermo disease is definitely prevalent in Harris Creek, and we knew that going in, but so far it's been at sublethal levels. And the water quality conditions remain favorable. Just a couple potential threats, because we always want to recognize that nothing is a panacea, although it's going quite well right now. Poaching, there were some poachers caught. People may have read about that. It is not at all clear how widespread that damage is, because right now the oysters that we planted are younger than market size. So nobody's interested in getting the oysters that we planted yet. So, that'll be a 3-year check-in when they're actually market size, and see if anybody's gone out there and taken them. Disease outbreak could certainly be a problematic, and like everything, if funding gets cut, we will probably be stopped in our tracks. I just put this next slide up to cue up Howard's point about, to sort of introduce him. It's great that we have Oyster Metrics and we're trying to build these to a certain standard, but we recognize that ultimately the reason we're building oyster reefs is not just to have 50 oysters per square meter. The reason we're building them is to have the ecosystem services that they provide, and Howard and his crew are doing a lot of work to try to quantify what this will buy us in terms of ecosystem services. Thank you.
Thanks.